World of Warcraft Before the Storm by Christie Golden is the latest in a long line of novelizations surrounding the equally long-lived MMO. Picking up immediately where the story of Legion leaves off, Before the Storm acts as both a primer and prologue to the in-game events of the upcoming battle for Azeroth. And boy does it do this well. Very well indeed, as its events tie not only into the game itself, but all of the extra content surrounding it, including the trio of comics Blizzard released as part of the lead-up to the new expansion. I've read smatterings of the World of Warcraft novels in the now distant past, mostly just preview excerpts released here and there. Largely speaking, they didn't appeal to me very much, even in spite of my love of many of the game's characters and my interest in the extensive lore Blizzard's seminal fantasy setting has crafted. In fairness, my disinterest was due in large part to a general sense of burnout on fantasy stories at the time, as my attempts to get invested in them came at a time where I was proverbially showered in Forgotten Realms novelizations by my friends. Although the tone and feel of the WoW novels certainly differed from those of Forgotten Realms, at the time they felt largely the same in my mind. The burnout was simply too extensive for me to give them the genuinely fair shot I should have. I think now that, if Before the Storm is anything to go by, I may well have to rectify this error, for Christie Golden's work at least. Suffice it to say, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. So much so, in fact, that for the first time in the last decade, I burned through it in just 2 days. Indeed, I utilized all the downtime I could muster to devour this story with the kind of gusto Trade Prince Gallywix must demonstrate any time he attends a feast, what with that gargantuan wasteland of his. In fact, not only was Before the Storm a wonderfully well-crafted story, Christie Golden's writing really shines here. It served to remind me of why I grew to love the characters of the Warcraft series in the first place. Why I've been playing these games and constantly coming back to this world ever since my childhood friend Noah introduced me to Warcraft 2 in the early 90s. But I'm rambling. Doubtless the reason all of you are watching this video is to learn precisely why I've come to hold this book in such esteem. And don't be mistaken, I hold it in very high esteem. It would not be a lie for me to state that this has quickly become one of my favorite books, one that I suspect I'll revisit a few times over the course of Battle for Azeroth and beyond. There are a few reasons, more than a few if I'm being honest, but I'll do my best to distill this review into the reasons that I felt were the most important. Chief among these points are the characters themselves. As stated earlier, Before the Storm picks up right where Legion left off. The war against the Mad Titan Sargeras and his Burning Legion, the most persistent and dangerous single threat the world of Azeroth has ever faced, has been fought and won, but not without great cost. In his final moments before his imprisonment, Sargeras plunged his massive unholy sword into the region of Silithus, piercing deep into Azeroth and wounding the planet severely. In the weeks since this wound was inflicted, a strange new substance has been bubbling up from the cracks and fissures that extend out from the unholy sword, a substance of incredible power that will change the course of the world. Azerite. The story primarily follows the exploits of the faction leaders for Warcraft's 2 primary factions, King Anduin Wrynn, leader of the Alliance, and War Chief Sylvanas Windrunner, leader of the Horde. Throughout the story, we see both leaders struggle with the troubles that have been left for them in the wake of the war against the Legion. Though they were victorious, their armies are depleted, their world is wounded, and the discovery of Azerite has set both factions on edge once more. Though the story is supposed to be that of both Anduin and Sylvanas, it follows Anduin much more closely, and with good reason. As the newly crowned King of Stormwind, thanks to the death of his father Varian at the beginning of the war against the Legion, Anduin is the much more human character of the two. And not just for the fact that he actually is a human. Throughout his portion of the story, we're allowed to witness just how strong a character Anduin is, and Christie Golden deserves full credit for this. Her presentation of Anduin's character allows us to feel like we're right there with him as he struggles with trying to restabilize his kingdom, keeping relationships with his allies strong in the face of heavy disagreements with his decisions, and coping with the old and new losses he endures and the responsibility that comes with them. Indeed, he is painted as a much more relatable character than he is in the game, where he can sometimes come across as overly idealistic and naive. Sylvanas' portion of the story has a distinctly colder feel to it, and this too is fully intentional. Though she is the war chief of the Horde, a mantle that she acquired at the beginning of the Legion conflict much like Anduin, it's made clear through the story that Sylvanas doesn't care as much for the other Horde factions as she does her own. She was the Banshee Queen, the Dark Lady of the Forsaken, well before she was war chief, and this fact seems to be the guiding line for her character throughout the story. Though her plots and schemes tend to benefit the Horde as a whole, it's made clear through her internal dialogue that the things she wants would stand to benefit the Forsaken far more. This is not to say that Sylvanas is portrayed as evil. It's certainly made clear that she values the Horde, but the depth of that value does not extend much beyond surface level. The Forsaken she values considerably more, as she views them as her children of a sort. But thanks to the forming of the Desolate Council, a political party formed by the Forsaken to manage day-to-day life in the Undercity in Sylvanas' absence, a thread of political and personal tension appears that Sylvanas follows all the way to the conclusion of the story. Again, while she's never really portrayed as evil, it becomes clear that in the years since the former High Elf was killed and raised as a Banshee, she's lost a lot of what we would call her humanity. There are other storylines explored as well, though most of them relate back to Anduin or Sylvanas. Almost all of the leaders from both factions' races get at least some face time in the story. For the most part, this limited face time is perfectly fine, though it does feel like the current Orc leader, the fan favorite Saurfang, does get snubbed a bit. Given the importance it seems he's meant to have in battle for Azeroth, I would have appreciated a little more than the brief appearance he receives. Apart from Anduin and Sylvanas, one more leader from each faction receives significant face time. For the Alliance, it is Genn Greymane, the former king of Gilneas, the great walled kingdom that bordered the now Forsaken-controlled kingdom of Lordaeron. Genn's place of importance in the story is very well reasoned. He is one of Anduin's primary advisors, and was asked by his father Varian to care for the boy king before he died fighting the Legion. He is also a staunch enemy of Sylvanas, the woman who killed his son, Prince Liam, when she led the Forsaken on an invasion of Gilneas after their wall collapsed during the Cataclysm. Greymane thus provides a good foil for both Anduin's youth and his calm, as the older and more experienced ruler is also much quicker to anger than the idealistic boy king. The Horde, on the other hand, ends up with a much more unusual choice. Where I would have expected the aforementioned Saurfang to fill this spot, it instead goes to the Goblin leader, Trade Prince Jaster Gallywix. This decision really perplexed me, especially as I drew further into Gallywix's portion of the story, which honestly isn't all that major. Ultimately, Gallywix is reduced to a plot device, a way through which we as the readers can eventually explore the concepts of what Azerite is capable of. The problem is that we don't explore that through Gallywix, but through other characters that he ends up dragging into his scheme. It should also be noted that the way Gallywix's storyline is handled is definitely the exception to the rule here. Most of the other storylines are both very entertaining to read and have a meaningful impact on the primary story itself. One of these is the Desolate Councils, which was by far my favorite of the side stories in the book. Through the two characters we follow most closely, Velcinda Elise Benton, who leads the council, and Parkwall Fintalis, we see a side of the Forsaken that's never really been explored in Warcraft before. These Forsaken are members of their race who remember well the lives they had when they were human, before being killed and raised as members of the Undead Scourge in the events of Warcraft 3. Their stories explore a much more relatable side of the Forsaken that hasn't really been touched on before. We learn of the people they were in life, the people they've since become, and how that's affected them, including the reason why they've begun to grow dissatisfied with their potentially unending existence. This does a great deal to expand the scope of the types of characters Forsaken can be. Whereas in-game they are mostly noted as being untrustworthy, scheming, and underhanded, Before the Storm shows that the Forsaken can be every bit as human in death as they were in life. Best of all, it does this by making these characters interesting and engaging, to the point where I genuinely felt for them in everything they endure throughout the book. Which leads me to the book's next strength, the writing. Christie Golden's style is very evocative, and though there isn't too much visual description put in the story, after all, it's expected that most of the readers will already know what the key people and locations in this story look like, she puts in exactly the amount needed to help you paint vivid pictures of what's happening and where. But as evocative as the story is, it's the character moments where Christie really shines. There are many times throughout the course of the story, particularly on Anduin's side of things, where I found myself getting choked up over the tragedies or left with that warm, fuzzy feeling in the moments of joy. Christie manages to make this story feel very personal, marking it both as a fantastic wind-down from the epic scope of Legion and an ideal lead-up to Battle for Azeroth. Her pacing is also top-notch. Even among the storylines I was a bit less interested in, I never once felt like the story was moving too slow or glossing over important details. Everything felt like it had a purpose, and it generally moved at just the pace necessary to let the details sink in without lingering on them longer than we needed. Unfortunately, now that I've mentioned those less compelling storylines twice, I feel I can no longer avoid talking about the book's shortcomings, few though they are. As the stories of Anduin and Sylvanas progress, so too do we get the shorter story of Trade Prince Gallywix. Well, not so much Trade Prince Gallywix, as a freelance goblin engineer named Grizek that Gallywix convinces to conduct experiments on Azerite. In fact, throughout the first third of the book, Azerite is the plot thread on everyone's mind, though it fades into the background for Anduin and Sylvanas somewhere around the halfway point. Unfortunately, what this means is that the Azerite plot thread becomes relegated to Grizek, his gnome assistant Saffronetta, and Gallywix and his goons. It's fun at first, especially since the early portions of it tie very directly to the concerns of Anduin and Sylvanas, whom the story is primarily supposed to follow. Unfortunately, I found that this plotline rapidly devolved into a distracting chore. The characters are all still very well written, of course, with Grezek, Sappy, and Gallywix each having their own distinct personalities and attitudes, but as the pair of engineers conduct their experiments, this portion of the story starts to feel like it was required writing for Christie, as if Blizzard swooped in and said, "Don't forget to explain the Azerite now! We've got to show how it relates to all the in-game professions!" Apart from this, there are no serious issues with the book, though, and even here the pacing is so well done that it doesn't quite feel like the distraction it ultimately ends up being. Still, I personally would have preferred to spend more time exploring Sylvanas' character rather than exploring all the little wonders of Azerite. In the end, Before the Storm was a wonderfully gripping read that I enjoyed through and through, and I would absolutely recommend this to any Warcraft fan, be it with the physical copy or the audiobook, which was how I experienced it. In fact, I'd suggest that even those who own the physical copy give a listen to the audiobook as well. The narration provided for it is superb, and part of that is due to the fact that Josh Keaton, the voice actor of Anduin Wrynn, was brought in to narrate. Well, that's about all I've got for you today, folks. I know this was a bit of a departure from my normal content, so please let me know if you enjoyed it. Have you read Before the Storm yet? If so, what did you think about it? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, leave it a like, and consider subscribing to my channel and following me on social media for more content, links in the description below. And as always, dear friends and gamers, it is my sincere hope that you roll high, roleplay well, and game on.